everyone, and welcome to Greenlight Bookstore. We are so excited to be hosting tonight's event with Saladin Ambar presenting his new book, Stars and Shadows, The Politics of Interracial Friendship. He will be talking tonight with Christina Greer, so you're all in for an excellent evening. Before I turn things over to them, just a few housekeeping things. If you could turn off or silence your cell phones. We do ask that masks are worn the whole time you're in the store, unless you were here on stage talking. We also have signed books for sale at the register tonight. And we're recording tonight's event, and it'll be available on YouTube in the coming days to share widely. But now on to the good stuff. Our interviewer for this evening is Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University. Her research and teaching focus on American politics, Black ethnic politics, campaigns and elections, and public opinion. Professor Greer is currently working on a manuscript detailing the political contributions of Barbara Jordan, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Stacey Abrams. She will be speaking this evening with our featured author, Saladin Ambar, who is a professor of political science and senior scholar at the Center on the American Governor at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. The author of American Cicero, Mario Cuomo and the Defense of American Liberalism, and Malcolm X at Oxford Union, which was nominated for a Hearst and Wright Legacy Award for Best Book in Nonfiction. He lives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His new book, Stars and Shadows, analyzes 2 centuries of noteworthy interracial friendships that served as windows into the state of race relations in the U.S., and, more often than not, as political history to offer a comprehensive overview of how friendship has come to shape the possibilities for democratic politics in America. So, you're in for something really special tonight. Saladin will be reading from the book, then Christina will join him in conversation, and you'll have the chance to ask your questions after that. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Saladin Ambar and Christina Greer.
Thank you very much. I'd be remiss if I didn't really thank Greenlight Bookstore for hosting this event, for Gabe for putting it together, and certainly for Christina for being here sort of last minute, and with all of her expertise and kindness. I am really, really thankful. So I'm going to take 10 minutes, if you don't mind, to read from the introduction, portions of it, to give you a sense and overview of the book. Hopefully that'll be helpful as Christina and I then proceed to interact, and then we'll open it up for questions. Introduction. Tea and Cigars, The Case for Friendship. In the summer of 1998, I moved from Astoria, Queens to Plainsboro, New Jersey. It was my first time living in anything approaching a suburb. All of the apartment complexes were named with great intentionality, lest I forget that was the case. Fox Run, Deer Creek, Quail Ridge, Hunter's Glen. I remember going out for a run in a nearby trail and nearly having a heart attack after what I thought was a rat had crossed my path. It was a rabbit. It was that kind of place. My neighbors would talk to me in passing, and I got to know a few of them in the most superficial way. There was the Indian couple next door, the friendly, cute girl who would catch a smoke on her second-floor balcony, a tall, lanky former professional basketball player who, for the sake of anonymity, I will call Paul. Paul was an older black man who grew up in the South and was now working at one of the nearby high schools. He had 2 Cadillacs, neither of which ever worked at the same time. He was always outside in the lot, 2 cars, 2 hoods up, figuring out what to do. I noticed that Paul had a friend, an older white guy I'd see him hanging with. They'd stand there talking, laughing. This fellow, I'll call him Peter, was always in a Mercedes with the top down, golf clubs in the back. He was retired. I seem to remember a blonde woman with him on occasion. He liked to wear hats. One Saturday morning, I think I was in a stupor from overeating and watching college football, I heard a knock on my door. It was Paul. "Hey, Dean, can you come help out, man? You busy?" "Sure, Paul, what's up?" "It's Peter, man. He's tried to hurt himself. He's upstairs." "Sure, give me a second." I had no idea what to make of what was going on, but I threw on some sweatpants and walked upstairs behind Paul, who was in quite a hurry. I remember being led into the apartment, into a bedroom in the back. Sure enough, there was Peter sitting upright in bed wearing a white t-shirt. He looked alert and just as calm as you might expect someone to be at home on a Saturday. Then I looked more carefully. There was a black object protruding from Peter's chest, and that black object was surrounded by what was a perfect circle of red blood. I looked again and could see that the object was a kitchen knife, the kind with the grooved wooden handle. Thankfully, I didn't pass out. I walked over to Peter. "Peter, I see you've tried to hurt yourself. Are you okay?" Yeah, I'm okay. It was stupid of me. I had no medical training whatsoever, and I offered what I could. Peter, do you mind if I pray for you? No, not at all. I prayed for Peter, and Paul and I waited for the paramedics to arrive. I don't recall much after that, but I did run into Paul a few weeks later in the lot, 2 Cadillacs, 2 hoods up. Hey man, how's Peter? Is he all right? Yeah man, thank God, he's gonna be okay. He was depressed, just got divorced, lost a lot of money. He's been real sad. I've been haunted by this story for many years, and it's one I've shared with my students on numerous occasions. After that day, I've never quite looked at myself or the world the same. Here was a man, he lived right upstairs from me. I knew next to nothing about him. As far as I was concerned, he was just a rich white guy cruising around playing golf and having the time of his life. I had no connection to him whatsoever. And all I knew of Paul was mostly superficial. Same for the cigarette girl on the porch, the Indian couple next door. I went over once for a Diwali celebration. Otherwise, I was clueless. It occurred to me that in my self-absorbed quest to do something with my life, I had taken for granted, people? I had very little sense of connectivity to my neighbors, and here I was teaching politics and history to my students. I was so self-assured about all I knew about the country, its past, and its troubles, but I was utterly oblivious to the pains, heartaches, and lives of those who lived, ate, breathed, and slept around me. Somehow I began to understand this not only as a personal failing, but truly one with democratic implications. I think this book began, in its own way, in that bedroom in 1998, standing in front of a man, a knife, and a little circle of blood. The great black scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois had something important to say about all this, and I'm not sure we've taken him seriously. I'd like to do that in this book. Here's what Du Bois wrote in 1903 in his classic work, The Souls of Black Folk. In a world where it means so much to take a man by the hand and sit beside him, to look frankly into his eyes and feel his heart beating with red blood, in a world where a social cigar or a cup of tea together means more than legislative halls and magazine articles and speeches, one can imagine the consequences of the almost utter absence of social amenities between estranged races, whose separation extends even to parks and streetcars. Was this merely a rhetorical flourish? Perhaps Du Bois was emphasizing, yes, just how separated blacks and whites were in Jim Crow America. And even if true 120 years ago, surely cigars and tea can't mean more than legislative halls today. Danielle S. Allen put it this way in her powerful work on race and citizenship in America. Is interracial distrust in fact a political problem, as opposed to, say, simply an embarrassment? The answer is clearly yes. The value of friendship as a fundamental quality of representative government can be traced as far back, at least to the Greeks, up until the Enlightenment era, where revolutionary France placed fraternité on par with liberté and égalité. As Wilson Carey McWilliams wrote in his magisterial work, The Idea of Fraternity in America, Greek philosophy saw fraternity as a necessity of life and politics. Life might be seen as a hierarchy of fraternities. The fraternity of blood yielding to that of association, which in turn yielded to that of the city. The movement from Greek to Christian fraternitas, the brotherhood and sisterhood of faith, to fraternité, involved secularizing the idea of fraternity and binding it to the calls for emancipation. The crucial distinction for the United States has been its size and diversity, twin obsessions of the founders. Where the Greek polis and their more modern counterparts, the Italian city-states, shared in a republican vision for political rule, they were small, largely homogeneous polities. Even the Roman Republic, the principal guiding light for the early American experiment in self-government, dissolved into empire and then anarchy. James Madison presumed that the expansiveness of American territory would actually serve as an advantage for national unity, as opportunities for faction to work its mischief would be countermanded by the sheer multitude of differences, along with a compound federal form of republic. All of this was made possible, though unmentioned in the Constitution, by the presumption of chattel slavery and the exclusion of Native Americans and women from political life. Whiteness, above all, was the bonding ingredient to the foundation of American citizenship. Each of the case studies presented in this book centers around how this democratic project might have been made possible through the seemingly less political domain of social relations. whether it be an invitation to W.E.B. Du Bois from William James to a private dinner at Harvard, for example, or marching together in Washington, once for jobs and freedom, as did James Baldwin and Marlon Brando, or marching for women's liberation, as did co-chairs Angela Davis and Gloria Steinem during the 2017 Women's March, or when Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel locked arms on the front lines in Selma. Displays of interracial friendship have frequently served as proverbial barometers as to whether equals deciding together in public was a viable enterprise. On occasion, such engagements have produced disagreement amongst the protagonists themselves, often around the meaning and significance of their respective endeavors. The business of friendship can be messy under ordinary circumstances. When imbued with the added pressure of consciousness-making politics, it can be nearly impossible. In speaking of politics and friendship throughout this book, I hope to expand the ordinary meaning of both words. Friendship as a private social bond marked by amity and trust, perhaps the most important quality of all, is well enough. While I speak of friendship in Stars and Shadows in this sense, I also wish to implicate the larger sense of friendship as an essential characteristic of democracy and one of the more powerful responsibilities of citizenship. Friendship may be a more superfluous, albeit admired aspect of citizenship in ethnically or racially homogeneous republics. This is not so for large multiracial republics. Thus, politics in the sense I employ it in this text is also about the creation of meaning out of social realities and all efforts to reshape them. As Danielle S. Allen has argued in her reflection on Aristotle, quote, friendship is the bond of the city, and political friendship is not merely a serviceable aspiration, but a crucial one. Whilst researching for this book these past 2 years, I've sought out not only historical but also literary examples of what a robust multiracial democracy looks like. Like countless others, I've been drawn to the story of Denver and Setha in Toni Morrison's Beloved. Equally poignant is the bond between Ishmael and Queequeg in Herman Melville's Moby Dick. The best models all seem inherently premised upon friendship, a bond that, unlike romantic love, holds no physical allure over us, and unlike familial ties, obligations to our friends are essentially self-generated. Sex and blood titillate, but friendship is the stuff of democracy. It is sustaining because it is voluntary and visionary at the same time. It is also a delicate and difficult enterprise, particularly among people taught, trained, and conditioned to believe that above all members of society, there is one group deemed intellectually, aesthetically, and politically superior to all. So no, we cannot, quote-unquote, friend our way out of white supremacy, but friends can and must be part of its undoing. The title of this book comes from what I believe to be a sacred and noble model, one not unclouded by its own time and points of reference, but a worthy one all the same. Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn provides, at least to me, a glimpse of what the path to true, unequivocal friendship might mean for our country. Stars and Shadows comes from a passage in Huckleberry Finn where Jim and Huck are in flight at night and about to board a raft to some still unrecognizable freedom. Students of philosophy will appreciate that it is quite literally time for the two to decamp from the cave wherein they have been living. As in Plato's allegory of the cave, their vision is limited. They have only enough light to see with, but not enough to be discovered by. Stars and shadows ain't good to see by, Huck narrates as the two continue their uncertain journey. Like many, I've been struck by how much Twain could get into a simple sentence. As Jim and Huck were late 19th century metaphors for what those with little standing in society could do in friendship, so it is with the idea that our efforts to remake our democracy today needn't be perfect nor wondrously illuminated. The friendship between Jim and Huck is the path. They are the stars and shadows. The search for a direction out of white supremacy and all other manner of anti-democratic ills must first be an inward one. This is not to the exclusion of real and well-lit paths marked by law, public policy, and societal transformation otherwise. But the real light is nameless, it is internal, and it is the work of friends. Thank you. A little more than 10 minutes there, I think.
No, that's okay. It has me thinking about a few other things. Okay. Hi there. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Try it again. You want to switch?
No, it's technically on. Okay. I can also just project. Oh, but you know what?
They're recorded.
Okay, so I'll keep this. So I want to thank you for allowing me to be, what is it, pinch hitter?
Pinch hitter, yes.
Right? To keep with the baseball metaphor, our dear friend and colleague Kim Johnson was unable to do this, so I'm filling in for her. Okay, so I love this book. I have a lot of thoughts. We'll get to Mark Twain in a second because Mark Twain is my favorite author. I'm on the board of the Mark Twain House. I just think his understanding of black-white relationships is just a perfect foundation for this book. But I've also, you know, is anyone in here an academic? Okay, so that's two of us. So academics oftentimes have multiple books in our heads in various stages. It's like Michelangelo's David, right? It's like all these different pieces of marble that are just being excavated over time. And so one of the books that's going to be my retirement book is a book on friendship. But it's an analysis of the Iliad and the Godfather. It's basically, it's like these two projects are nothing but friendship.
I will buy that book on the record right now.
I will try to write it. And it comes out of the fact that, for those of you who know about the Divine Nine, the black fraternities and sororities that exist, my father's a member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, and of those Divine Nine fraternities and sororities, the Omegas are the only ones who have friendship as a tenet. So it's like uplift and perseverance and excellence, and you all may know that Kamala Harris is an AKA. So, you know, she's part of the Divine Nine, but the Omegas are the only ones who put a real price on friendship and what that means. And so I grew up with all these Omega uncles, and so I've been thinking about friendship for a very long time, but also growing up in Philly, going to predominantly white schools. I went to Tufts and Columbia for my education, so I went to an HWCU, which is a historically white college university. Howard and Hampton are known as HBCUs, because those universities were set up for the production of white knowledge, as opposed to Howard and Hampton, Spelman, Morehouse, etc., the 117 HBCUs. So I've been thinking a lot about interracial friendships, many of which I've had over time. Some have fizzled out in the great summer reckoning. Some of them were ended, and ended. And then some are really strong, and they sort of transform out of time and space, I guess you would say. So I'll always start with kind of the basic softball question. What motivated you in this moment to write about friendship, interracial friendship? Because you said you worked on it for 2 years, and I was like, 2 years, if I subtract, that would be the summer reckoning. Or was that something that had been germinating in your mind for quite some time beforehand?
So, you know, I mentioned Wilson Carey McWilliams in the introduction, and he was one of my graduate professors, and he was a friend to many, very literally, and a very powerful friend, particularly to graduate students. He's written one major book, and, you know, The Idea of Fraternity in America, but his teaching and his life purpose was very much directed to friendship. You felt it with McWilliams. And when he passed in 2005, and I would encourage you all to read his obituary in the New York Times, it's pretty profound. You know, I felt something go out of me. I think a lot of people felt McWilliams' loss. So that, his work and his life spoke to me. You know, the academic reason for why I wrote this book was because I was working on a Du Bois and William James article about their intellectual collaboration and double consciousness, which is a concept that Du Bois perhaps, maybe likely, borrowed from James and used it to for the purposes of, you know, making it apply to race in America rather than psychology. So I'm writing this article, and I do a workshop out at the University of Oregon for my dear friend and former dissertation advisor, Dan Titchener, who has maybe 6 or 7 other people workshopping their various projects. And at some point when we're talking about this article of mine, people begin to say, hey, this is a nice friendship and a nice analysis, but have you thought about doing more? Because if you were to do more, we think there's a book here. And of course, you're like, oh, get out of here. And I'm like, really?
Let's say more.
Really? Oh, come on. So, but I did reflect on it, and I did think there was a book in it. But an even more personal reason has to do with the last few books I wrote that were not I did write a textbook somewhere in there, but there was a book on Malcolm X that was mentioned at the introduction, and then there was a book on Mario Cuomo. So, you know, and we were talking about Italy a little bit in the pre-discussion here before you all arrived, but, you know, my mother's ancestors come from Sicily, and my father's family is African-American from like Florida, Georgia, etc. So I think the psychologist among us would say, you worked out your Black and Islamic roots and heritage, growing up in New York as a Black dude who was Muslim. You worked that out in the Malcolm X book, you worked out the Italians in the Mario Cuomo book, and now you're looking for some kind of synthesis. I think there's some truth to that. And I think you also, this was not a first book. This would not have been my first book. But this was a book of yearning and longing to personally connect deeper with all kinds of friends, but certainly thinking about my life and friendship more broadly, and who are you at a certain point of your life, rather than what are you accomplishing, but who are you and what is of value in your life. I think those were the kind of ruminations beyond the academic, and even the purely psychological. It went deeper than those things. It went to a kind of sense of purpose through history and through research, getting at a gnawing quality that I suspect lots of us feel, and maybe the pandemic has brought that out, which is the issue of connectivity. And who are we really connecting with, and why are we connecting with them, and are these relationships meaningful or are they superficial? I thought, in hindsight now, looking back at it, all of those things played a role in talking about and making this the topic of my book.
Yeah, I like this idea of synergy, because when I'm mentoring graduate students, I always tell them when they're working on their dissertations, it's like when you're anyone here is a graduate student, you're writing 2 dissertations, or you're working on 2 things at the same time. One is your topic, and the other is about yourself. There's a reason why you've chosen your particular topic, right? So you're kind of working out their issues. Because it's like, I didn't choose to write about Japanese hanging gardens, or Russian cars. It's like, I chose Black ethnicity, because there was always this gnawing conversation about, oh, you're really smart, you must be Caribbean. That's what I am, Black American, right? Or it's like, oh, I'm just Black, right? So this idea that I can't be American without a Black prefix, but I love the Black prefix. But so that's what I was working out in this academic way, but it also, you're excavating some real emotions that have been ruminating for a very long time. So until you sift that out, you actually can't really write. So as I was reading this book, I was thinking about the pairs, and I actually do love the fact that you had women in the book, because so many academics forget that women exist in society. I mean, it's fascinating. It's like, ain't I a woman, to quote Sturgeon. But as and for those of you who haven't looked at the book just yet, I'll give you all a rough idea of just some of the combinations. I'll mention a few, but my personal favorite, having relatives from Florida, is Mary McLeod Bethune.
I'm glad you brought that up, because she doesn't get enough attention in these talks, and in general, she doesn't get enough attention. So
she
thank
does
you.
not, and I think No Leeway Rooks at Brown, I believe, is working on something about Mary McLeod Bethune. But there's so many people who just aren't discussed enough. This is why I'm writing a book about Barbara Jordan. She's number 2. So we know all about Shirley Chisholm, who's amazing. Never doubt that. But Barbara Jordan is a Black woman from the South. And a whole host of things. But here's some of the pairs. Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. Oh, sorry. We start with Benjamin Banneker and Thomas Jefferson. Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln. W.B. Du Bois and William James. Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt. Ralph Ellison, Shirley Jackson, and Stanley Hyman. James Baldwin and Marlon Brando. I love the fact that when you were talking about the March on Washington, it's the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. And most people don't put that last little piece on there, but that contextualizes the whole conversation and the whole friendship. There's Ella Fitzgerald and Marilyn Monroe. There's Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. There's Angela Davis and Gloria Steinem. We're going to get to that one in a second. And there's Barack Obama and Joe Biden. Of these pairs, or of this set, is there any friendship group or friendship pair that you left out, or that you wish you would have put in, or did Gabe at Oxford not let you put someone in, right?
I've thought a lot, long and hard about this, because people won't let me not think long and hard about it, because you should have did Basquiat and Andy Warhol, right? Or you should have did Jackie Robinson and Pee Wee Reed, so that people have, and I think that's part of the objective in a way of the book, is to get people to think about American history more broadly, and think, well, look at all these other pairs that could have gone in, why not them? But also, hopefully, one step further, to think about your own life and what pairs you got going on, right? So that's part of it. I think because athletics and music are so grounding to American culture and political life, I would argue, in their own way, reflective of that at least, I think it would have been interesting to include those. But then, it probably would also have been that much more difficult to get women involved, particularly if you're going into athletics. Not necessarily so, but,
Yeah.
and then at some point you have your cases and you have 10, and they seem to also reflect my strong suit. So there are probably maybe a few more presidencies involved because I'm a presidency scholar. And so it's a little heavy in that way, but, I probably felt more comfortable writing about some of those cases. So, I could easily see, not to give Oxford University Press a heads up on this, but I could easily see a volume 2 of a whole slew of other cases. And I think I will also say this, and I allude to it in other part of the introduction. I think, look, there are no Asians, no Latinos, there's, no Muslim Americans, I don't think, no, in this, right? So there are a lot more Arab Americans. So you could think broadly, or indigenous folk, you could think Bobby Kennedy and Cesar Chavez, right? There are other groupings, and I think what I would hope is that other scholars, people who are writing about interracial friendship or thinking about pairs in this way, would take up, that axe, if you will, and broaden it out instead of the black-white binary, which is a shortcoming of the book, I would say.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'd agree with that, because so much of America is this black-white binary, right? I mean, everything else, I'm a scholar of race, so I would argue that
It sets the path.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whites versus the non-whites, and now in my book I argue it's blacks versus the non-blacks. So I do think that you have left fertile soil, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a shortcoming.
I appreciate that.
You have tilled soil for other scholars to come and really think and conceptualize other friendship groupings. Because I do think that we need to understand how Asian Americans have fit in and not fit in, Latinos fit in, indigenous folks. But so much of the foundation of the United States is built on not just white supremacy, but a specific anti-black racism.
No question.
That is at the heart of so many of these conversations, of their friendships. That's what I thought was so powerful about the book. That being said, in this kind of era of reckoning, which, I don't know, I thought we were marching for something totally different and we got Juneteenth, but that's a whole different conversation. I was like, when did we ask for Juneteenth? But here we are. It's we want freedom and equity and not being
It's like Halloween. Sometimes you get something different candy.
Right? It's like,
oh,
candy is this. Right. But so in this era, whatever it is that we're in, whether it's a new Reconstruction, whether it's a passive Civil War, I don't know. As an American politics professor, I'm very concerned because I actually feel very unmoored in this particular racial moment and climate. Do you feel like this book is necessary to help people understand the power of interracial friendships? Because I love what you said. It's like, we're not going to friend our way out of white supremacy. And I'm sure a lot of people want to take a quick shortcut. It's like, well, I have a friend. It's like, my question is always, listen, most white people say they have a black friend. When you ask them if that black friend is in their employ, that number drops from 80% down to 10%. It's like, your housekeeper's not your friend. Your nanny is not your friend. If they're on your payroll, they're not your friend, right? You may think so, but they don't think so. Because there's a power dynamic. So in this particular moment, what is the real value of real interracial friendships? And my follow-up to that is it possible, knowing what we know about this country, are true, genuine, equal interracial friendships possible?
It's the question in Invisible Man that Emerson asks the nameless protagonist. Can we take off our masks and be friends and can we so it may, let's throw this out there. Let me throw this out there. It may not be possible. Defeat may be our reckoning, and I think we have to accept as a culture, winning and coming out ahead and optimism is such a illusory and illusionary kind of thing for Americans. It's sort of, how we project ourselves in the world. When I wrote that book on Mario Cuomo, he said, after he lost the mayoral race, he said, they asked him how he felt. He was like, my whole faith is premised on the guy that got nailed, to the cross, defeat the great line from Julius Caesar, by Brutus, I will have attained more in this defeat than young Octavian and Anthony will have by their vile conquest. It may not work. Huck and Jim may not make it. They don't know. They got to put out that fire because they'll be seen. And stars and shadows ain't good to be seen by. The road is murky in this country. It's always been murky. It's pretty dark right now. I'm interested in the attempt. I'm interested in, all we have control over is the effort and the attempt. And I think, let's call it for what it is. We are in a moment of rising authoritarianism, fascism in this country. A clear, stark erosion of all kinds of democratic norms that I talked a lot of smack like everybody. Oh, the end is nigh, but it's really not. We're not just talking about it anymore, in the coffee shop. This is real. And so, when you lose the democratic institutions and the processes are not functioning well, you have to go back, in my mind, in part in writing this book, is you have to go back to what I call the blocking and tackling of democracy, citizenship, virtue, friendship, the responsibilities of people who have control over things that they otherwise wouldn't have control over. I can't control what Joe Manchin's going to do tomorrow, and I damn sure can't control what Marjorie Taylor Greene's going to do. But I can control the approach I have to fellow brothers and sisters who may not look like me. I can see the world differently. I think this is a Kingian vision of love, ultimately, for politics. And somehow it comes down to us as very esoteric and ethereal, etc. But at the end of the day, it is really practical. Because, particularly in a large republic, you have very little control. The further removed you get from being able to hold office and conduct yourself with real efficacy and agency, you've got to come back to the essentials. And I am arguing that this is one of the only ways we have to turn this tide around, which is to become more bonded together as citizens and to see beyond the superficial and to get to know people beyond I was at the Diwali celebration, or my housekeeper is great, or whatever, to really make meaningful connections. And that means sometimes arguing, as some of these protagonists in the book do. And I would say it's an essential ingredient. Disagreement and confronting real challenges within a relationship is essential, rather than friendship on the cheap. So yeah, I think it may not be possible. No, it may not be. But I think that's the beauty of Twain's allegory. Hey, stars and shadows ain't good to see by you. Good luck. But they push off anyway. They push off. And remember I'm riffing now, but remember in Beloved when, I guess it's Denver and Semper, they're on the run too. And there's this beautiful allegory of democracy as fugitive by the late Princeton political theorist Sheldon Wolin, describes democracy as fugitive. And they're on the run, this black woman and this white woman, and Toni Morrison describes them as two throwaway people. And I love that, because two throwaway people, what chance do they have? They ain't got no chance, but what else are you going to do? You got to try. You got to do it.
Well, I think so much of the beauty and the curse of American democracy is all about how much we're investing. Baldwin talks about this all the time. And the dedication that so many black people have had to a country that has not had the same dedication to them. But it is this idea of the journey, right? Because we may never see this destination. I mean, my parents saw great progress, and now they're seeing great regress in their entire lifetime. And so what does that then mean? We're going to get to Twain. Like, I'm just stalling, but, because everyone talks about Huck Finn, which, as they should, because of this friendship. But my intro to really loving Twain was Pudd'nhead Wilson, which is a book where essentially Beloved sort of starts off similarly to Pudd'nhead Wilson, which was published in 1894, I think. But an African-American enslaved woman has a son who looks exactly like the master's son. The master is missing some money, so he tells all of his enslaved Africans that he's going to sell all of them down the river. And so we know what down the river means. And so she decides to switch the two children because the master doesn't really know. They're both so light, right? So race is a construct. They're the same complexion. Here we are. And so essentially her son is raised as the white child, the slave master's son is raised as the enslaved, and it's a beautiful foil because they do have a friendship. But because Twain was so bad with his money, for abolitionists, he wrote it so that you take a good person, and so the black person who's raised as a white person is a terrible, mean, horrible, evil person. He ends up going to Yale. And so, I'm not saying, I'm just saying, he ends up going to Yale. But Mark Twain is making this point where, for the abolitionists, it's the institution of slavery that can change a good person and make them this horrid individual. For staunch segregationists and racists, they're saying, see, no matter what circumstance you give a black person, whether they're enslaved or whether they're the most educated person on the East Coast, look at how they behave. But there was a friendship. There's several different types of friendships. There's kind of like a foil twinship throughout the entire book about this black-white relations. Because we also see how close we've always lived to one another in this black-white dynamic. I mean, yes, our churches are segregated by and large. Our neighborhoods are segregated, but there's always been this conversation of black people and white people together. My family from Tennessee, passing, for example, right? So, as Ta-Nehisi Coates says, those who believe they are white. So this idea of interracial friendship is like, well, you may be in an interracial friendship, so you think, or you might not be.
Right.
You actually might just be friends with a passing black person. Who knows? So I think this book is really powerful, and I want to ask you, where do you think it fits in with the sort of very popular notion, it may not be being recorded, so I won't give my thoughts on this popular notion of how to be an anti-racist, right? Because that's very popular. But I do think that for some people, not all, but for some people, that is friendship on the cheap. That is sort of like, well, I voted for Obama twice, I would have voted for him a third time if I could. Yeah, we get it, we know. But what does that then mean when it's part of this friendship is heavy lifting? Part of that friendship, as you say, it's the arguments, but it's also, it's the listening. It's the recognizing that you could be wrong about something that you've been taught to believe your entire life. Like, how do these historical friendships, by and large, fit into, I think, this desire for us to just be close, quickly, and I would argue sometimes cheaply?
Right. No, I was so frustrated. I don't know who it was. It was an overall great review, but like the headline was something to the effect of, why can't we all just get along? I was like,
It's one of those like problems is easily won or easily lost. Right.
I feel it. I think in a word it comes down to self-examination. Critical self-reflection, particularly as a white person, but for any party in this relationship. I think it's really important. There's a moment, Eleanor Roosevelt is helping out Mary McLeod Bethune. She's helping her where she can. Southern Democrats don't want FDR to do anything with race, obviously, and so she's trying to go through the back door and help as part of the Black Cabinet, help Bethune in Florida and elsewhere get resources to black people. There's a pandemic going on, a tuberculosis outbreak in Florida, and she's asking for beds. And Eleanor's doing what she can, at least as much as she believes she can, and I think she is. But there's a moment of self-reflection. Now, this will sound superficial, but what's important isn't even the issue, it's the reflection, where she thinks to herself, I kiss all my white girlfriends when I hug them, I kiss them all. I never kissed Mary McLeod Bethune. And one day, they're talking, whatever, and they say goodbye, and Mary McLeod Bethune gets kissed by Eleanor Roosevelt. I wish I could have seen her face. Eleanor Roosevelt said, I have to do this for me, because there are barriers I still have with you. Frederick Douglass was very self-aware of of the space he occupied with whites and how his physical presence alienated him. I mean, he could look at Andrew Johnson and be like, this is no friend of the Negro. I call it the elevator test. You can get in an elevator with some white folks, you can tell.
My grandmother always said, he's half a racist. I'm like, I don't know what that means. It's like,
right. But when Douglas was in the room with Lincoln, they argued and debated, but he left feeling like, I felt big in there. He treated me with respect, treated me like a man. It wasn't about my color, So I think self-examination, yes, about the serious things, but also the more mundane things. Check yourself. We all need to check ourselves. And I think in a world that is governed largely by white supremacy, along with other kinds of ideological and deeply worrisome and problematic assumptions, I think, certainly as a male, right? we all need to check ourselves. Why am I acting the way I'm acting? How can I be better? You know, you see this self-reflection with Brando, you know, particularly later with indigenous people, but he's the one that introduces Baldwin to some of the Black Panthers. It's not the other way around, you know. Self-reflection is so important, and not on the cheap, not just, well, I had lunch with, or I dined with, or I met with. You're thinking about who you are. You're thinking about your own conduct in the relationship. How can I deepen it? How can I be more meaningful? What can I do what am I not doing? You know, I think, you know, there's no simple or easy mathematical or quantitative answer to these questions, but the democratic life is premised on deliberation. The first form of deliberation is with yourself. Right. You know, and I think that's a huge part of it. And some of these narratives, these stories bring that out particularly well. Some of these folks really do engage in it better than others. You know, Woodrow Wilson, no self-reflection whatsoever, right? You know, none. You know, none.
Well, and I think, you know, as I tell my students, all of my students have to have two favorite presidents. They have to have a favorite president, and then they have to have a favorite living president. My favorite president, hands down, is LBJ. Like, now, for those people who have some thoughts on the Vietnam War, they're like, what are you talking about? But as someone who really appreciates what he did to help pass the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and Immigration Act, he's my favorite nonstop. And so it's interesting when you have MLK and Rabbi Herschel, and I wouldn't say that LBJ and MLK had a friendship, but they definitely had a level of respect, right? But what I always tell my students, because if you all know anything about LBJ, when he started off as a member of the House, staunch racist, he's from Texas, right? That's how you get elected. And then as his power amassed and the offices became bigger, he evolved with the time. So he evolved with the office, but he also evolved with the time. So by the time he moves from representative to senator to vice president to president, we see a totally different LBJ. Now, still a little loose on the N-word, a lot loose on the N-word. I listen to presidential tapes, but he's just like, sorry, I'm from Texas. Like, this is how we talk. Sorry, Martin, I forgot you were here. Literally, just N-word, N-word, N-word. It's like, oops, you're in the corner, right? You're diminutive. So I say all that because I respect his evolution and I respect the movement to the left. With someone like Gloria Steinem, I struggle. And I don't know why, and so maybe I have to check my sort of gender biases. But I think about someone like Shirley Chisholm, where when she ran for the presidency in 1972, when all the Black folks met in Gary, Indiana, and they were like, we want to put up a Black person for the Democratic Party. And she's like, here I am. And all the folks were like, oh, by Black, we meant Black man. Sorry, Shirley. And then she goes to Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug et al. And all the white feminists and says, hey, they're like, we want to put up a woman for the presidency. It's 1972. And she's like, here I am, I can do it. Sitting member of Congress, right? The first Black woman ever elected to Congress. And like, oh, by woman we meant white woman. And I just feel like there have been a few examples of that with the Gloria Steinem piece. And so that was kind of my needling question, where it's like, okay, so I know you've evolved, and I know that you've done a lot, but I genuinely, just using her as a sort of unfairly singling her out, but like, is it really possible when you think about the evolution has a point? Like, you're liberal to a point.
It's interesting.
You're accepting to a point. Oftentimes it feels like these friendships are, as long as I don't have to ever change, or as long as you never get above me, right? So like, we could possibly be equal, but like, you can't ever supersede me, and that's where the dynamic will go amiss.
It's a powerful question. So look, let's talk about Gloria Steinem, who was at a forum in Brooklyn not that long ago with Angela Davis, one of the few times they interacted together on stage. And there was a kind of friendship and amity between them, but of all of these, it was probably the least intimate of all of the relationships. And it took me the longest to write that chapter. Man, I was like, I'm done with this book. This later for this, I'm on to the next book. And I was talking to myself, and then I was like, I need to do more homework on this. It's Gloria Steinem and Angela Davis. So, you know, their first meeting is problematic. What is it? It's 1962, the World sort of Youth Forum it's Communist Youth Forum in Helsinki. And Angela Davis is there because she's a Marxist. And Gloria Steinem is there because the CIA sent her to put down, communist influences among American youth. Now you talk about evolution, but that's the same woman who supported, Mumia Abu-Jamal and his very controversial incarceration case. She was someone who really began talking about intersectionality as a white woman. She really helped shift that narrative from the Betty Friedan kind of feminism to, the question of black feminism. She really, among whites, she really did that. And then she also chaired the, Free Angela Davis Fund, which cost her politically and certainly earned her the enmity of, lots of traditional white feminists. So she's also had a kind of distancing at times from people like Shirley Chisholm and others. I wish I could say all of these friendships are of one type. What I have learned or found is that, again, like the narrative of, or the illustration of Stars and Shadows, there's some rough going,
like real friendships.
Like real friendships. The Baldwin Brando friendship is just beautiful. It's so intimate, physically intimate, most likely, but also just the letters that that Baldwin writes at the beginning to him in that chapter. They're so close, and we shouldn't even talk about our friendship. Baldwin says, "I'm not even going to talk about Marlon Brando," because it's that deep, right? But then you get to Steinem and Davis, and it's like less so. But the way I want to de-gender fraternity is to make it less about kind of a male notion of friendship, certainly, but the political notion behind what I think was the spirit of the French Revolution, which is that this is about political, the deepening of our political bonds that brings out our humanity, and love and affection towards one another, as brothers and sisters would. And I think the politics of that for Steinem have been, uneven over the years. But I will take any day of the week, the dissemination of the idea of intersectionality, that black women taught white women what feminism is. Those are Steinem's words, not anyone else's. That she was instructed about what feminism is for black women. And she did have meaningful relationships with black women. They just weren't very deep with Angela Davis. But she did put her neck out on the line with Angela Davis in that moment. At a moment where Angela Davis was in prison because she was accused of, helping, being complicit in killing a white judge, right? Difficult moment. She did not have to do that. So, as Douglas said about Lincoln, taking him for all in all, knowing what her community restraints were, as well as what she was willing to sacrifice, I'm going to include her within the canon of folks that I think deserve, applause and deserve, to be held up for the kind of friendship they have. But it's probably the weakest in a very literal sense of the friendships in the book. It's probably the weakest one.
Well, it also makes me think about all the different types of friendships I have, right? Even just the professional or political friendships that I have, and they're the deeply personal ones. And so obviously it would make sense that they operate on varying frequencies. So you said you kind of struggled with that chapter. What was your favorite chapter to write? Because when writing a book, everyone has like a favorite chapter. Mine is chapter 4 in my book, and I just,
Yeah, so I love the Baldwin and Brando, because I have a New School connection, so, they both were in the New School. Baldwin was there really not going officially. He was going the way, people go sometimes, attending classes, sneaking out, whatever. I love that relationship, so beautiful. It's a beautiful relationship. But look, I'm a sucker for Abraham Lincoln. You like LBJ? Mary McLeod Bethune liked LBJ. I like Lincoln, Now, my next book is on Abraham Lincoln, and I would argue that he returns to first principles the way LBJ told liberals he was returning to first principles with respect to race. I've always been a liberal. I've always been on the left. I've always supported black folks. It's just I never had the power, kind of a thing, right? I think that for me, that chapter, Lincoln and Douglas, I can tell that story. I weep. I'm a crybaby. When Lincoln is in the White House and the cops are escorting Douglas out of the White House in that third meeting after the second inaugural, and Douglas realizes he's being kicked out, and he's like, hey, tell Lincoln I'm here, you know, and then Lincoln sees him, and he shouts out, ah, there is my friend Douglas. That's for the white cops, or guards, I say cops, just to make it present. That's for them. It's for the white attendees at that ceremony in the White House, and it's for white Americans. You know, when this thing ends, you can hear Lincoln saying, when this thing ends and, you know, these people are free, that's not the end of it. You got to make them your friends. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, you got to make these people your friends. That ain't enough. Here's my friend Douglas. He has Douglas, he's in another meeting. I guess it's the second meeting with Douglas. And in this second meeting, I think there's a governor of Connecticut sitting, waiting to meet with Lincoln. And he's like, come on, man, I've been here for a while. You know, you're sitting with me. And Lincoln says, tell the governor out there I'm sitting here with my friend. The word friend is important for Lincoln. You know, these people can't just be these people, you know, anymore. They've got to be more than that. That's taking on a kind of assertive quality that I think is really significant and I think beautiful. And I think part of what the capacity that we have in our friendships. I think this is important. I think it's true in the romantic relationships as well. But you're always getting something out of that. And you're getting something out of your family relationships. And you get something out of your friendships, but it's different. You can create something beautiful with a friendship. And damn it, we need beauty. We need something beautiful to counteract the ills and the evils and the atrocities that we see happening in our own republic over and over again. The ability to create something beautiful is significant. And I think that's important.
Well, I mean, my grandmother used to always tell this to my father. She passed before I was born, so he's passed it on to me. And he always says, friendship is essential to the soul. And so as a political scientist, I was a classics minor as an undergrad, so all this is, you know,
Right up your alley.
right up my alley. But when we think about friendship as like essential to the future of this democracy, that's, you know, we're not going to friendship our way on white supremacy, but it's like, but there's a certain level of connection, right? If Banneker or Olson is correct, and the logic of collective action is such that we need to be together, essentially as close to one as possible. If this whole experiment is to work out, friendship is one tenet to do so. In thinking about that, we've had this whole conversation for an hour now, and one friendship that has not come up yet is our good friend Barry Obama and Joe Biden. Because their dynamic has shifted over time, right? This is a man, when Joe Biden was running against Barack Obama, don't forget in 2007, 2008, right? He calls him clean, shiny, and articulate. There's an age dynamic, which always complicates things. So you have this older white man who goes on to serve at the pleasure of the president, which I think, you know, for African Americans, we know that is what helped Joe Biden become the 46th president of the United States, where black people were like, this is a white man who did not undercut this black president, not once. Now, with marriage equity, going through the Supreme Court, he says big effing deal and kind of changes the news story, but that wasn't an undercut, that was just him being, you know, Joey from Scranton. But it wasn't malicious or, you know, intentional. So there's a level of respect that I think black people have for Joe Biden that a lot of folks don't understand. And their friendship is fascinating because there is this age dynamic. There was this kind of shifting of the power dynamic. We did sort of, it's like, we heard you, Joe, the first thing you said, but you played your position. For 8 years you played your position and didn't waver. We haven't seen white people like that. It's like, we don't know those white people.
How to explain this? You know, particularly in the last 40, 50 years especially, you know, as black folks have moved into, you know, corporate world, politics, how many times have black folks become supervisors and been undercut by their white subordinates, right? And
or even by someone who they thought was a friend.
So, you know, if you got, you know, Jim Clyburn, people, well, what turned it around? Jim Clyburn in South Carolina, why would these older black folks or any, you know, why would they, because you know what, they went to work year in, day out, and they were undercut by their white colleagues 99 out of 100 times, and here's Joe Biden, loyal as a dog, loyal as the day is long, and he didn't once, with any intentionality, do anything other than be loyal back to Barack Obama. And you know what? Baby, you got it, because
that was a reward.
Yeah, 100%. And you know, now it's a crying shame that has to be, that's on some level a kind of low bar, but for black people that's not a low bar.
Well, I mean,
in
Well,
our
you think about-
experience
Well,
in America.
And this goes back to the central like black-white dichotomy that is the United States of America that's built on white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and anti-black racism. Because I think about someone like Bernie Sanders, where it's like, well, black people should want, what Bernie Sanders is selling. It's like, well, he couldn't even humble himself to go to South Carolina to meet with James Clapper. So like that to me is like such a visual, going to this point of like, can these friendships ever be equal? Bernie Sanders has worked with Clyburn for many, many, many years, but couldn't humble himself to
Bernie
do it.
doesn't have the mistakes that Biden has made orally over the years, stumbles and even the ones you mentioned with Obama. But black folks have seen Biden's flaws. He's been around. We know Joe, that kind of thing. And a lot can be forgiven of a friend when they show you their flaws. You talk about the moment when after surgery he lifts his shirt up to show a scar. It's kind of, that's sort of LBJ. But there's a point there, like, hey, I'm like you. Here, see, I had surgery. I'm the president. There's something about that that's there's an honest integrity to that quality within Biden, and it resonated, and I think maybe a little less so now, but still resonates, I think, with many African Americans. No question about it.
Okay, so last question, I guess, before we open it up to audience questions. So you alluded to the next book is Abraham Lincoln. What's the hook?
Prophet of Darkness, The Making of Abraham Lincoln is the working title. It's premised upon his 1838 Lyceum address in which he talks about mob violence and the rule of law being lost. His law partner, William Herndon, says it's the best speech he ever gave, and the purpose of the speech, Herndon says, is because a black man named Francis McIntosh was pulled out of his jail cell and burned alive in St. Louis. Why don't we know this speech? Why hasn't there been one speech, book written about it? Nothing. Now, the premise of it is that Lincoln is not just talking about the McIntosh case, he talks about the killing of Lovejoy in that speech, which Lovejoy was the white abolitionist writer who gets killed because he was supportive of McIntosh and abolition. But Lincoln also talks about the murder of these white gamblers in Vicksburg, Mississippi. 5 white folks just killed because they're sinners. And he's like, this is our suicide. We will die. Suicide will be our lot, right? We don't have to worry about Russia invading. It's suicide. And so what I'm arguing, hopefully in this book I just began writing, is, the idea that the 1830s, because of Alexis de Tocqueville, we all love Tocqueville and political science, they don't even let you teach unless you love Alexis de Tocqueville, right? Well, I understand that. But because of de Tocqueville and because of the age of Jackson and this euphoria over the expansion of white male suffrage, a very important moment in American political history, very necessary, we lose sight of how dark the 1830s were, how homicidal and genocidal and Indian removal and expansion of slavery and mob violence and all these murders Lincoln is seeing, racially motivated, marginalized people getting killed. He says, we got to do something about this. We'll lose our republic. And the fact that he connects the republic to these violent acts against marginalized folks, particularly at the center of it, the detail with which he talks about McIntosh's killing, this is very important and very visceral. And when I look at white scholars writing about the Lyceum address, they say, well, he never really, that was the worst of his addresses, and he changes his rhetorical style. I'm like, I don't give a damn about his rhetorical style. Look at what he's saying. And it's a very powerful, radical speech. And I'm arguing that when the Lincoln who's Lincoln the Emancipator hasn't just moved progressively along and decided, here's a moment where I can save the Union. That's part of it, to be sure. But he too is returning to first principles before his political career had to be, controlled. And so I'm excited about it. And I'm sure there'll be a ton of Lincoln scholars that may or may not be excited about it, but that's my next project, yeah.
Fantastic. I love the fact that everything, the undercurrent is, how do we not just save this democracy, but live in it in our full selves?
Absolutely.
And is that possible? Question mark.
Yes.
All right.
Thank y'all for listening.
Thank you all
And
so
thank
much.
you.
My pleasure. So I guess we can open it up to audience questions. You all have any? I see a hand.
So first of all, this has been so awesome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. You touched on this idea of deep segregation across kind of our institutions and our communities, segregated schools,
Even in businesses, you kind of see more people of color, for instance, in lower management or not even management. So I'm just wondering, how do you suggest people begin forging these connections and friendships in spite of these divisions?
I think, in a word, it has to be a conscious decision that you make, you know. And yes, is the onus maybe a little bit more on white folks? Maybe, yeah, I think so. But it's on all of us, to be sure. I think you have to be, this is a conscious, you know, all these seminars on what business leaders have to do, and we spend a lot of time talking about or thinking about, you know, sort of executive leadership, but we don't really factor this into how are we creating an environment where we're treating people humanely, and we're also, you know, building social ties that, you know, are critical, I think, right? We know that because people are friends, they climb up the corporate ladder, right? That's why, you know, Augusta had to desegregate at a certain point, right? Because, you know, when you golf, you talk business, right? But it's deeper than that. I think it has to be a conscious part of what we do. You know, back to the French Revolution, you know, liberté, égalité, fraternity. Nobody really thinks about fraternity. Certainly not in this country, hardly, you know. But I think what I'm hoping this book does is that and what your next book will do, is build more of a case about why that can't be the case any longer. We have to incorporate that into as a fundamental aspect of what it means to be a democratic citizen and leader. So I think it's a conscious effort on our part as human beings. And how do you do that? Well, you get people to write about it, you put this in film, you build a culture around it as best you can. I think it's not an easy answer. I wish I had a more readily available, easier answer.
It's a hard question.
Yeah, it is. It's a good question, no, for sure. Anyone else?
I have a question for Kate. Well, it seems though, I of course, a big fan of the book, and there are kind of two stories that you told in the book. There's one that these examples are perhaps kind of historical causes of racial progress. So you see that these friendships were important for creating a somewhat more equal society in America, equal politics in America, and also that these friendships are symbols or models for how we can build better friendships. I mean, Ella Fitzgerald and Marilyn Monroe seem to be more of a symbol, where we have, you know, Douglas and Lincoln. Really, that was important for creating a better politics. When we're looking at our own lives, or we're looking at the lives of, you know, people that are modeled on TV, are we looking for the friendships that are going to make like a real difference, you know, out in the world, or are we just looking for people just to spend time with? And when do we know when it's going to transfer into the other one? You know, how do we actually build power out of our friendships?
You know, I think, you know, fundamentally, you start with the premise that it doesn't matter. You know, you may not need to look to take on the democratic project of resolving America's descent into chaos and authoritarianism when you make a friend, or as Danielle Allen talks about, talk to strangers, or as Paul Gilroy says, you engage in the politics of conviviality. You don't need to take on the whole burden of, you know, this sinking ship. Just be a great democratic small d citizen as best you can, and be a great human being. But as you, and this is something we often share with our students, I know I do, you know, well, like LBJ, when you get into a position of authority and power, when you do have an opportunity to do something, to make a symbolic move, or to do something substantively that's going to alter people's lives, then you use that relationship for the public good. You know, Benjamin Banneker had plenty of white friends. He didn't need anyone. He was a free black man in Maryland. He was happy. He had lots of good white friends, scientists, just normal farmers. But I need to make, I'm a sucker you, Thomas Jefferson, into calling me one of your brethren. You're going to sign your name, your obedient, humble servant, Thomas Jefferson, because that's politically meaningful to me and my people, right? And Jefferson does. And Jefferson gets into a little bit of trouble for doing that, right? For signing off that way to this free black man. So, you know, I think we start with just a fundamental human thing, which is, I'm not, like the movie Traffic, I'm probably dating myself. It was a good movie. Don Cheadle, ask your grandparents about Don Cheadle. There's a moment there at the end of the film where, Cheadle sort of has to make a decision. Am I ever going to stop the drug trade? No, but I got a job to do. And it may make it better for one family. You just start with the fundamental premise of you doing your job. But if enough people do our job, something catches. And I think there could be a moment. I'm hoping that there's enough misery out there and enough desire for connectivity, period, but certainly attached to the racial morass that we're in, for us to do this personally and privately, but also to make it opportune when necessary, when we have the ability to do so, and broaden it out and make it into that fraternité, degendered, for the public good, for the polity. That's what I'm hopeful about. If you tell students, or if you tell yourself, I gotta resolve this descent into anarchy and chaos, you won't do anything. You stay in your house and eat Haagen-Dazs like me. But if you just think about it in terms of, I can do my part.
I say it's the brick by brick theory that I try and sort of remember. It's like, I'm doing the best that I can do in my capacity. So I write about democracy, I write about the hope of the American dream, I write about all the problems that this country has been and continues to be. But there's so many great people that have been invested in this nation to make it, we're a bloodthirsty nation. We can't get away from war. We love a good genocide, right? Chattel slavery for centuries. I mean, how we treat women. I mean, we've just been a horrible nation from its inception. So our origin story looks nothing like our origin, right? So the origin story is full of hope, and it's interesting. It's like, this is basically like Kim Jong-un's origin story. It's like completely made up. But when you look at like the reality of what this country is, it's pretty dark and grim and bloodthirsty. But there's always been these like real gold nuggets. Like, the idea of America is phenomenal. When you read the Constitution or the Federalist Papers, there's a lot there to sort of grasp onto that's really inspirational and aspirational.
What did Dr. King say? All we're asking America is be true to what you put on paper.
That's it, right? I mean, because the thing is, it's like, you're presenting yourself like you're a Ritz-Carlton. You're a Hojo at best, right? And so it's like, so if that's the case, but we've all been working, not all, but many of us have been working to make it better. So I think of it as these individual connections and relationships are the actual real undercurrent of what this country is really about.
I agree wholeheartedly. And I am drawn back to Paul Gilroy's Politics of Conviviality, that you can create something different, in the culture, in the society, by your actions. And just, making that individual effort can change the fabric of things. And you mentioned The Godfather earlier, and I'm thinking about when Connie at the end of the film says, she shows the newspapers to Kay, this is your husband, right? It's like, she's so Kay is so emblematic of sort of the, naive American. What? I didn't know they were shooting people. I had no idea.
I mean, so this is going to be a whole other talk, because I'm like, she is and she isn't, right?
Well,
she did kill that baby, and she knew what she was doing there.
She sure
so,
did. Okay.
I mean, this will be a whole other talk about.
We're coming back for the Politics of the Godfather a year from now.
Yes, I think so, because, there is so much about fraternity and what America is, right? Don't forget, The Godfather starts with Michael in his army uniform. Yeah. In a bloodthirsty nation that can't stay away from war. The opening scene is Michael is he is a product and property of the U.S. government, and switches to the real fraternity, which is his family, and the mob.
Then you give your loyalty to your country and not your blood, as Sonny would say, right? Yeah. Hey, I knew I liked this person. Not one of my top favorite people right now.
So before we let you all go, because I know you all need to go home, and we want to thank you all so much for having us at Greenlight. When Sal asked me to join, our good friend couldn't make it for medical reasons, and Sal says, and it'll be really great to meet. And I said, I need to remind you that we have met before. And it was a long, long time ago.
Some friend I am.
But no, but it was a long, long time ago. And I was applying for a job at Rutgers. And I went for a job talk, and for those of you who know anything about academia, they usually have a faculty member take the candidate out to dinner the night before, and then we have a long day of interviews and meetings. It's just on your feet all day. So Sal's tasked with taking me out to dinner in New Jersey, and we go to an Ethiopian restaurant. So I had to remind him, I was like, and I love Ethiopian food. However, for a job talk, not the best cuisine. We're eating with our hands. We're sharing food, and you have to have a pretty strong constitution if you don't eat Ethiopian food all the time. Your stomach needs to be, luckily I have like a good tank of a stomach, but for a good like 16-hour day the next day, it's like, hey Sal, just so you know, that's not the best dinner food for a job candidate who needs to be up at 6 and talking and presenting for the next 16 hours. So
Next job talk, I'm taking you to Perkins.
Right.
We're going to Perkins.
So, I'm so glad you were able to join us. Obviously, this is the beginning of many conversations.
I'm so glad to re-meet you.
Yes, re-meet, and if you haven't already, get Stars and Shadows, The Politics of Interracial Friendship from Jefferson to Obama. And thank you very much.